Thank you all for coming. It's a lot of people here. What I was thinking I would do is I'm going to show work of mine that's more or less, can you hear me okay? Does everyone hear me all right? Is that good? More or less the last 10 years or so of work, focused more on recent work. But going back roughly 10 years. But before I do that, because a lot of that work deals with similar kind of content, and that content sort of comes out of some research that I was doing and some writing that I was doing, I'm going to read you this text that you'll find, I think afterwards when we're looking at the work, that there's a lot of sort of resonances there. But it was a text that I wrote after I was, excuse me, doing, I did a residency at the Frankfurter Kunstverein in Germany related to research I was doing in early book illustration. And specifically in Frankfurt, I was looking at the Walter Benjamin Children's Book Collection at the University of Frankfurt. And Benjamin had been kind of fairly influential in a lot of stuff that I was doing earlier, not the usual texts that most people in art school all read, which is the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, but some of his other works on narrative and storytelling, which are very related to the work that I'm doing now as well. So, and I had written this kind of text, and there's a set of images to go with it. They're not really great images. They're, you know, I had a hard drive crash after I got back from Europe, and I lost a whole lot of the material. And some of it was embedded in a text, so I pulled it out, but it's not the best quality and the best sort of images, and not all of the images are there. So I've got some of the images from this text, which are, some of them are, you know, from quick photographs that were taken in various archives at various times, and others are from other places. So I'll start with this text and the few images that go with it. That's about half an hour, and then I'll go to my work. But as I said, there's a lot of echoes and stuff like that. So if we can get this woken up, there we go. So this is a little essay called Walter Benjamin, Copies and Clever Cats, Aura, Oral, and Benjamin's Children's Book Collection. Starts with a little quote by Susan Buck-Morse from The Dialectics of Seeing. No modern thinker, with the exception of Jean Piaget, took children as seriously as did Benjamin. 19th century children's books were one of the most valued parts of his one passionately held possession, his book collection. The building housing Walter Benjamin's children's book collection at the University of Frankfurt is sprawling, unornamented, and a bit forbidding. But crossing its grounds, I was sure I heard a nightingale, a bird whose range, for the non-migratory North American at least, is confined largely to the European fairy tale. It seemed a fitting announcement for Benjamin, and not only because of the bird's traditional association with literature. In Hans Christian Andersen's story, The Nightingale, an emperor, at first captivated by the little bird's song, soon becomes disenchanted and replaces the living creature with a mechanical reproduction. Given the growing secondary literature around Benjamin's work, there's an argument to be made that stories, childhood, and experience, in quotes, are somewhat neglected aspects of his writing. I visited Benjamin's collection along with other archives in Munich, Frankfurt, and Berlin during a residency at the Frankfurt Kunstverein. Benjamin's collection was of particular interest because his work includes essays on storytelling, toys, and illustration, along with radio pieces that he made for children. The children's books he preserved in a darkening Germany also include the kind of small early volumes whose origin is neither in written text nor picture, but in the oral fairy tale, a subject Benjamin explored in writings like The Storyteller and in other essays less well known than his seminal On the Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. But the little pictures in children's books tell their own story about reproduction and the aura, about how their meanings are inflected by time, context, visual or literary, and conditions of scarcity or excess. Hovering between visual and story, the illustrations act as a kind of nexus, raising questions about the place of early hand-copied illustration within discussions of mechanical reproduction. And they also problematize the notion of experience Benjamin developed in his writings, a notion embedded in a deep appreciation of history and historical consciousness. Of history's two main currents, the recorded events and deeds of great men, or what's called the mentalité of French historians like Braudel, Bloch, and Febvre, it is the analysts whose structures of everyday life resonate with Benjamin's writings on experience and storytelling, and with the staircases, arcades, and morning wash basins of his autobiographical little volume called Berlin Childhood. Approaching the collection, the university's imposing architecture is a reminder of its refusal to grant Benjamin the habilitation necessary for an academic position. Without it, he returned to the arcades, becoming himself a sort of figure of folktale, intellectual wanderer, peddler of insights, rag-picker critic, freelance philosopher, and one of the keenest observers of modernity that Europe produced in the years before his unhappy ending at Port-Bou. It may be that his exile from the academy contributed to his heightened appreciation of both modern and pre-modern experience. For Benjamin, it was the unremarkable sensory matter of the everyday world, that which slips unnoticed and unregistered into memory, that constitutes experience, defined or suggested, depending on the essay, as unconscious absorption of sensory data rooted in the mentalité of a slower time. He saw experience diminished by the self-consciousness and shock of industrialism and urbanism. In On ce motifs in Baudelaire, he described the modern shrinking of experience in fairy tale terms as a kind of disenchantment, and the resulting atrophy of our shared sensory reservoirs as a particular challenge for writers and artists whose memories, like Proust's Madeleine, were dropped from the calendar of collective memory and common rituals of recollection. Benjamin's sympathy for the pre-modern in essays dealing with experience and storytelling grates at his iconic text on mechanical reproduction, an essay infused with the urgency and agency of its time. In it, art for art's sake is condemned, futurism's aestheticized violence deplored, and cinema proposed as a superior political practice, with painting relegated to negative associations with the past, with class, religion, ritual, ownership. That which withers in the age of mechanical reproduction is the aura of the work of art, he wrote, proposing a Brechtian critical self-consciousness to combat fascism's harnessing of modern cinema to unconscious resonances of the past. Decades later, Benjamin's call to arms has its own Wikipedia entry, the only one of his texts that seems to have its own Wikipedia entry, which sums up the aura like this. The aura is the sense of awe and reverence one presumably experienced in the presence of unique and original works of art. The aura inheres not in the object itself, but rather in external attributes such as its lines of ownership, restricted exhibition, or publicized authenticity. Aura is thus indicative of art's traditional association with primitive, feudal, or bourgeois structures of power, and its further association with magic and religious or secular ritual. But in The Storyteller, Benjamin presents a much more sympathetic view of the past and its rituals. This is a quote: "The reception of a story requires a state of relaxation which is becoming rarer and rarer. If sleep is the apogee of physical relaxation, boredom is the apogee of mental relaxation. Boredom is the dream bird that hatches the egg of experience. A rustling in the leaves drives him away. His nesting places, the activities that are intimately associated with boredom, are already extinct in the cities and are declining in the country as well, lost because there is no more weaving and spinning to go on while they are being listened to. The more self-forgetful the listener is, the more deeply is what he listens to impressed upon his memory. This is how today it is becoming unraveled at all its ends, after being woven thousands of years ago in the ambience of the oldest forms of craftsmanship." That's the end of his quote. The nature of the dream bird is developed in Marxist Freudian detail in On ce motifs in Baudelaire. Experience, for Benjamin, how things are absorbed is critical. Experience is the material admitted into unconscious memory through an earlier kind of boredom, now lost to modernity's consciousness-inducing rhythms. What distinguishes factory work from weaving is the vigilance required in the face of the violent, determining rhythm of the machine. The dream bird can't nest there as she might on loom or spindle. But while wide-scale craft production has disappeared in the 21st century West, it continues elsewhere. And it's also possible that some small repetitive activities, domestic ones, for example, like telling stories to children and the small labors associated with them, rocking, singing, washing, knitting, folding, cleaning, feeding, repeating rhymes, maybe some of the last branches on which Benjamin's dream bird might alight for some modern Westerners. Perhaps this linkage of experience with stories in childhood is why Benjamin was so passionate about children's books. At least one might imagine this while reading bedtime stories to children in the wide, slow rhythm of early child-rearing, the slurred sense of time, the rituals of rhymes and songs, and the routines of story time, nap time, bedtime, with the same books opened up to the same pages, digging themselves deeper into experience with each again. Living the illustrations in picture books through young children who see their first images as both forever and true is also an early developmental moment that evokes the historical one Benjamin sketches in The Storyteller, a moment where images were rare, scarce, and powerful, and where, at least for some, illuminations in a hand-copied book of hours rocked in a ritualized rhythm still echoed in small childhood routines. The realm of childhood, stories, and experience are not male domains, which may explain the neglect of this aspect of Benjamin's work. Certainly people like Jeff Wall and all those guys, they never talk about that part of Benjamin. They talk about the other parts. Art historian Janet Wolfe describes Benjamin's flaneur as the distanced, anonymous icon of alienated humanity on the brink of commodity capitalism. In The Invisible Flaneuse, an essay she wrote, she also argued that, quote, the identification of the figure of the flaneur as a central figure of modernity is one that totally excludes women, since women were, quote, not at liberty to engage in aimless and anonymous strolling, unquote. If women were home telling stories to children, Benjamin seemed not to notice, focusing instead, in the Storyteller essay, on the male storyteller, Leskov, even though storytelling is at least as much a female domain. And while experience may be extinct in Western cities, it's worth noting that in another part of its range, Benjamin's dream bird is likely still nesting in lands, if not long ago, then at least far away. Various forms of craft production are still carried out by women and children in countries where farming methods also recall the time of Charles Perrault. They are simply offshore and out of sight of Benjamin's intellectual descendants. In the developing world, one still sees the ox, plow, or scythe of 17th century illustrations of Puss in Boots. Examples of fairy tale are reproduced in other places. So this is a 1695 illustration for a hand-copied early edition of Perrault's collection, one of the Perrault collections. They went by various names in various editions, Contes de Fées, Les Contes de la Mère Royer, or various collections like that, often the same tales collected. So this is, as I said, I started looking at, when I was looking at the illustrations, I was going back to earlier and earlier versions, seeing how far back I could get with the illustrations. And what I found was with the earlier the illustration, the more likely it was really very closely copied on an even earlier illustration. So this is 1695. This is 1697. I'm trying to remember where they're all from. I've located them in various archives, some online archives, some real archives. This is another version shortly after 1697. Often the images are flipped. They're slightly altered from one to the next. You can see that somebody's looked at either the plate or the illustration itself and, done a copy, then it was printed. So those are some examples of the close illustrations. And this is just an image of a contemporary image of a scythe and the wheat sheaves, sort of similar to the tools used in 1697. Copies of copies of copies. Here's Benjamin again in The Storyteller. There is nothing that commends a story to memory more effectively than that chaste compactness which precludes psychological analysis. And the more natural the process by which the storyteller forgoes psychological shading, the greater becomes the story's claim to a place in the memory of the listener. The more completely it is integrated into his own experience, the greater will be his inclination to repeat it to somebody else, sooner or later. Experience, which is passed on from mouth to mouth, is the source from which all storytellers have drawn. And among those who have written down the tales, it is the great ones whose written version differs least from the speech of the many nameless storytellers. It is the great ones whose written version differs least, he writes. This is a remarkable sentence for a writer widely associated with modernism. Does it suggest that Benjamin has different criteria for words and for pictures? And if so, what of the illustrations in the children's stories he himself collected? Comparing early illustrations across different editions, one can't help but notice that they seem to perfectly illustrate Benjamin's requirement for stories. Tiny, with stiff figures. This is one of the remarkable things when you go to the actual archives and look at books of this sort of vintage. The books are like this big, right? They are tiny, and the illustrations in them are this big. They are just minuscule and almost sort of invisible. They're hardly sort of loaded with either psychological shading, or they're certainly chaste and compact, as Benjamin describes. Where was I? Tiny, with stiff figures lacking in artistry or psychological shading. The little pictures seem mere copies of one another, closely modeled on existing versions. Like photographs, they seem simultaneously original and copy, undergoing a kind of doubled process of reproduction, first by hand and later through mechanical processes like copperplate engraving or woodcut. As such, they occupy an uneasy intersection between Benjamin's views on visual reproduction in the work of art essay and his writings on storytelling. For example, similar illustrations of Puss in Boots appear in 18th and early 19th century Perrault collections. A 1742 horizontal version from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. In that archive, it's also found in Toronto's Osborne collection. The Toronto Public Library has a lovely little collection of historical children's books. This is found there. This is, as I said, from 1742. It's a horizontal version. This is a vertical version, obviously almost identical, except it's vertical and slightly altered. That's from 1785. That's in the Osborne collection and probably other collections. And at the International Jugendbibliothek in Munich, I found a woodcut from 1801, clearly modeled on the others. So you can see these illustrations just sort of, passing through time, barely altered. I mean, just barely altered and really clearly hand-copied sort of models of one another. So what does the distinction between original and mechanical reproduction mean for hand-copied illustrations or images like these? Are any of them original in the way we have come to understand the term through Benjamin's work of art essay? Unremarkable and lacking in authenticity, place, prestige, or lineage, the little pictures seem already mediated, lacking the qualities associated with the aura. Do they speak to a critical modern notion of art's technological reproducibility, or to Benjamin's views of storytelling as unconscious oral experience? Are they works of art, or just part of the storyteller's craft? Like the vagabonds that populate them, early illustrations migrate between categories of original and copy. And as bits of labor, certain pictures or scenes also migrate between completely different narratives, emancipating themselves from particular tales or publications. An identical destitute family appears in Le Petit Poucet in a collection in, I'm trying to remember where that one was. I think that one was in Frankfurt, this one. And you can see at the bottom it says, Hansel und Gretel gehen mit den Eltern, da-da-da. Here's the same illustration at the State Library in Berlin. Le Petit Poucet les laissait crier. And il marche, il avait laissé tomber le long du chemin les petits cailloux blancs. So it's like a totally different story, but exactly the same illustration. So these pictures just kind of migrate. Not only are they copied, but they can be reused for different stories and reintegrated into different narratives, which is kind of curious and sort of interesting. Contributions from different illustrators might also be recombined in the same edition or reformatted and recombined with others. These two are from two different versions of Le Maître Chat. The images get mixed up with different images and recombined in different places in the story. These are from the Benjamin collection. All together problematizing any notion of a sort of original image. Benjamin acknowledges that, in principle, there's another 3 related images from 3 different archives. That was a picture taken when I didn't have a camera and used my computer. That in principle, a work of art has always been reproducible. Man-made artifacts could always be imitated by men, unquote. The works of masters were routinely copied. But aside from this acknowledgement, the status of the hand copy for minor works is not pursued in depth. One can imagine a time at which the copy was not a thing that was diminished. Perhaps earlier conditions of scarcity made the hand copy an honoring of the original as much as its evacuation. Separated by expanses of time and space, early copies evoke the silent, empty places that gave rise to them. In an article called Traces of Craft, Esther Leslie writes of the storyteller, quote, "The ability to tell stories," Benjamin tells us, "is rooted in 2 factors, travel to faraway places and knowledge of past local lore," unquote. "The wayfarer," she writes, quote, "is key to Benjamin's ontology of experience. The German word for experience is Erfahrung, and it finds its root meaning in the word for travel, fahren," unquote. It's also worth noting that the same association occurs in the English term journeyman, a craftsman who's gathered the required experience through his travels. And a similar intertwining of space, time, and distance is seen in Benjamin's definition of the aura. Quote, "Every day the urge grows stronger to get hold of an object at close range in an image, or better, a facsimile, a reproduction." Benjamin writes in the Work of Art essay, The aura is, quote, "a strange tissue of space and time, the unique apparition of a distance, no matter how near it may be," unquote. Oddly, the uneasy status of the hand-copied illustration finds a counterpart in photography. In Walter Benjamin and the Aura of Photography, Carolyn Duttlinger observes that despite its supposed role in the demise of the aura, Benjamin celebrates the auratic qualities of still photography. She quotes a bit of his Little History of Photography in which the physical distance of painting's aura is replaced by the aura of the photograph. Distance across time becomes the spark of historical contingency. Quote, "The most precise technology can give its products a magical value, such as a painted picture can never again have for us. No matter how artful the photographer, no matter how carefully posed his subject, the beholder feels an irresistible compulsion to search such a picture for the tiny spark of contingency, for the here and now with which reality has, so to speak, seared the subject." This might be related to I can't remember my Barthes, but the studium or the punctum or the whatever, I don't know, some of you might remember that from, I think, Camera Lucida or something. Anyway, as Duttlinger writes, quote, "In discussions about aura, photography is commonly associated with its decline," unquote. She adds, "Aura and photography are not mutually exclusive opposites, but are in fact engaged in a complex process of interaction. The seemingly paradoxical notion of a photographic aura complicates received assumptions about the historical, aesthetic, and political parameters of Benjamin's thought," unquote. Fairy tale as metaphor, scarcity and excess. As Benjamin acknowledges, stories always traveled, whether as oral tales or objects. Fairy tale scholars like Jack Zipes and others note that some of the Grimm or Perrault stories thought to be collected directly from oral tales were actually in written circulation earlier in works by Straparola and Basile. Stories like Puss in Boots may have even earlier antecedents in India. The idea of craft, so central to Benjamin's storyteller, also resonates within fairy tales themselves, which take crafts like weaving and spinning as subjects. Craft gives rise to magic in a way that industrial production cannot. Spinning straw into gold, for instance. Change in status is achieved through changes in clothing or representation. In Puss in Boots, a clever cat reverses the fortunes of a poor miller's son by altering how he is seen. the magical, transformative quality of clothing, reflecting a historical context in which what one wore or was prohibited from wearing by right, custom, sumptuary law, or scarcity bound one to a rigid, stratified social order. In the past, the power of fine goods as a vehicle of imagined transformation was gathered from this rigidity as much as from their scarcity, something which, as socially mobile consumers of images and things, we can only dimly imagine. Thus, stories of transformative boots are a hinge pivoting back and forwards from a past where real changes in status were impossible to a present where they are routinely achieved through commodities and their own aura thereby diminished. The usefulness of tales like Puss in Boots for marketing consumer products was seen early. Tales of magical transformation through fine objects became a vehicle for selling smaller, cheaper copies and commodities, and the smaller changes in social status that accompanied them. New consumers could purchase Puss candy tins, spoons, plates, linens, umbrella stands. The social climbing cat became a salesman for shoe polish, meat extract, matches, rubber boots, and household cleaners. These are some examples. This is a véritable extrait de viande, Liebig. There's millions of things like this, of ads using early advertisements, using particularly this story. This is one of the favorites for advertising. Shoe polish. J.J. Granville, an illustrator who I came across when I was doing the research into early illustration, and before I knew this, but it turns out he was an illustrator whose work greatly interested Benjamin. He fleshes out this transitional moment between fairy tale and commodity capitalism. He has a lovely book. There's several books. You can find stuff on him on the internet quite easily now, but at the time I just happened across an old 1865 edition in a library somewhere of a book called La vie privée et publique des animaux, which is a sort of allegorical, it's a collection of stories by writers like Balzac and other people, illustrated by Benjamin. It's really a wonderful text. Anyway, so he fleshes out this transitional moment between fairy tale and commodity capitalism. And in The Dialectics of Seeing, Susan Buck-Morse writes, quote, "The earliest Passagen work notes state that the work of Granville is to be compared with the phenomenology of Hegel," for Benjamin. She also notes Benjamin's interest in the modern role of fashion. Fashion covers up reality, he writes. Like Hausmann's urban renewal, it rearranges the given, merely symbolizing historical change rather than ushering it in. Granville's drawings illustrate historical shifts both past and present. In La vie privée et publique des animaux, we see creatures not in the traditional animal helper roles of fairy tale, negotiating wished-for transformations between the fixed status of feudal peasant and prince, but decked out in the full array of the more mobile social classes of the 19th century. Capitalist turkeys, worker starlings, owl merchants, flaneurs, finches. Not only does Granville, as Buck-Morse points out, offer a critique that Benjamin appreciates in his Passagen work fragments, but looked at today, Granville's work evokes the fairy tale quality of a recently forgotten past, a moment when the full range of representations of class were still visible to us, before Western industrial workers had moved offshore and increasingly into what Doug Saunders has called the arrival cities of the developing world. Both Granville's images and the societal shifts he described have been, so to speak, reproduced around the globe, while simultaneously made absent for us in the West. Fairy tales still travel. This is a Granville illustration. It's not as clearly, it's here because there's a copy of it by Hausmann, just to show you how thorough this copying process was. It just sort of went on all through these kinds of things. I mean, it happens in high art too, but in illustration, it's very common. Fairy tales still travel. Not long ago, but in a land far away, developing economies like India now undergo transformations from traditional agrarian societies to urban developed ones, not dissimilar to the modernism that so engaged Benjamin. And fairy tale is still enlisted in the change. GMO products are marketed as magic seeds. Rural farmers, like the protagonist in Jack and the Beanstalk, now exchange their cows for original, patented GMO product seeds, which, unlike native seed, is not naturally reproducible. But soil depletion and other problems mean these stories don't have happy endings. Rural areas slide further backwards into the Middle Ages, while cities undergo fairy tale transformations where Western goods and lifestyles are reproduced. Benjamin's Paris, capital of the 19th century, has become Mumbai, capital of the 21st. And despite predictions of its demise, fairy tale and the sense of distance inherent in the aura also persist in the small land of contemporary art. A world which, since it detached from traditional moorings and overarching narratives, has been defined by its own evolving condition, manifest in a meta-narrative or story, a dialectic between text and artwork that finds form in illustrated books, like the exhibition catalog. How these narratives increase the value of artworks may be one of the last echoes of fairy tale figures like clever cats. From Duchamp's Urinal to Manzoni's Merde d'Artiste and beyond, the transformation of straw into gold, of the reviled into something of great value, is accomplished most dramatically in the world of contemporary art. This occurs in part through what is for many people both its invisible story and a kind of manufactured scarcity that recalls the age of fairy tale. One of the things that surprises the unaccustomed visitor to a contemporary art museum is the lack of things. The expanse of bare wall and empty space that swaddle the few chosen objects, lifting them from the ordinary and reframing them with a loaded absence, often condensed into that chained brick of accompanying text. While Benjamin linked the aura to pre-modern art, contemporary art's own lines of ownership and restricted exhibition are manifest in prestigious collections, auction prices, Turner prizes, monographs, reviews, or catalog essays, all contributing to an aura that artificially reproduces both scarcity and distance in what Benjamin called the theology of art. Indeed, in a culture of excess, scarcity and selection become the added value, as we see in the migration of the word curate, from the religious through the museum to the mundane. Cory Doctorow recently looked at the terms second life in the digital world, noted as well by Jeet Heer, who explored its popularity in terms of things like curated fashion, curated menus, curated movie reviews, curated albums, and curated comics. In a context of excess, Heer writes, "We have content providers galore. What we need are more content selectors." Not far from Benjamin's children's book collection, at the Columba Museum in Cologne, this kind of scarcity achieves its desired effect, conferring upon its scant contemporary contents an aura like those of the centuries-old liturgical objects which form the basis of its collection. Works by well-known artists like Canellis are joined by a humble group of old vacuum cleaners leaning in a corner, a work created by the curators themselves. In an otherwise bare room, a small shopping cart is filled with tins of penitent cream by Thomas Rentmeister. The text reads, "Who has been playing here and not put things away again?" After Benjamin's children's books, perhaps it's just coincidence that Columba's stark stairway reminds of Rapunzel, and the works resonating with experience are those that return us to the everyday, the domestic, childhood. But the scarcity that lifts these objects into the realm of magic disappears the moment we step outside, into the streets and shops full of commodities made in places where scarcity is real, not artful. Like the ontological complexities of the handmade copies in the books he collected, and like the conditions of scarcity and excess, the constraints of story or text versus image mediate and inflect Benjamin's ideas of aura and experience, as we see perhaps most clearly when he writes about his book collection in Unpacking My Library. While a critical view of its disappearance from visual art, the aura's disappearance, has come to us through works, through things like the Work of Art essay, the aura is clearly celebrated by the bibliophile Benjamin, who eulogizes the memories, places, and authenticity embedded in the lines of ownership and aristocratic inheritability of the rare original edition. He writes, Here's a couple of selections of quotes from him. To this day, Balzac's Peau de Chagrin stands out from the long rows of French volumes in my library as a memento of my most exciting experience at an auction. As I pick up my copy, I see not only its number in the Rumen collection, but even the label of the shop in which the first owner bought the book over 90 years ago. Once you have approached the mountains of cases, what memories crowd in upon you? Or this, inheritance is the soundest way of acquiring a collection. For a collector's attitude toward his possessions stems from an owner's feeling of responsibility toward his property. Thus it is, in the highest sense, the attitude of an heir, an aristocratic heir. This is Benjamin speaking, okay? And the most distinguished trait of a collection will always be its transmissibility. The phenomenon of collecting loses its meaning as it loses its personal owner. Even though public collections may be less objectionable socially and more useful academically than private collections, the objects get their due only in the latter. Memories of the cities in which I found so many things, Riga, Naples, Munich, Danzig, Moscow, Florence, Basel, Paris. A real collector, a collector as he ought to be. Ownership is the most intimate relationship that one can have to objects. I remember, for instance, that I once ordered a book with colored illustrations for my old collection of children's books, only because it contained fairy tales by Albert Ludwig Grimm and was published at Grimme. Grimme was also the place of publication of a book of fables edited by the same Albert Ludwig Grimm. With its 16 illustrations, my copy of this book of fables was the only extant example of the early work of the great German book illustrator Leser. That was the first illustration I showed you, that wonderful little capitalist puss. That's Leser, Benjamin's favorite book illustrator, who lived in Hamburg around the middle of the last century. My reaction to the consonants of the names had been correct. Dates, place names, formats, previous owners, bindings, all these details say something. Like the enigmatic hand copy, the artful aura constructed of scarcity, or the magical contingency of a still photo, the resurgent aura of the book collection, in Benjamin's own words, underscores his contradictory and complex resistance to easy categorization. Benjamin was likely right to declare the dream bird extinct in the developed world. Andersen's dream bird, or his nightingale, the story of the nightingale, is set in China, another now rapidly modernizing economy. In the tale, the living bird is brought to the palace by the kitchen maid, the only character familiar with its rural nest. It's the female domestic worker, not the modern urban flaneur who possesses experience. After the emperor has tired of the real bird and replaced it with a machine, the mechanical bird breaks down and the emperor falls ill. The living nightingale returns to the palace to heal him, and the emperor vows that henceforth the bird will not just sing for his amusement, but will be sent out to bring him news or stories from the far reaches of his kingdom. And so the nightingale becomes Benjamin's traveling storytale, returning with Erfahrung, experience. Far away, where real scarcity persists, where daily life may be closer to the way it was when oral stories were first copied down, Benjamin's dream bird may still be glimpsed. And while the aura can be reconstructed in various artful ways, the experience he identified in the storyteller undergoes its last transformation in parts of the world where both stories and experience, like the early illustrations and collections such as his, differ least, his words, from earlier versions. George Steiner's remarkable little book, In Bluebeard's Castle, takes its name from another fairy tale copied down by Perrault. In it, Steiner tried to account for the horrific aspects of modernism that culminated in Benjamin's death. He echoes Benjamin's ideas about experience, describing how seismic shifts of modernism had literally quickened the pace of felt time. But the unfulfilled promise of that speeding up, its disenchantment, had produced an ennui very different from the boredom of pre-modern craftsmen, and ominously expressed, according to Steiner, by Théophile Gautier's plutôt la barbarie que l'ennui. Steiner also distinguishes between religions based in monotheistic word gods and the more adaptable, image-friendly religious stories of Christianity. Like religious narratives and artworks, fairy tales have proved very adaptable, incorporating earlier myths and harnessing them to new economic forces. Describing the paroxysmal dislocations of modernism that gave rise to the Germany of Benjamin's day, Steiner describes man as suddenly, quote, alone in a world gone flat, unquote, where both heaven and hell have disappeared. Of the two, he writes, hell proved the easier to recreate. The pictures had always been more detailed. That Benjamin collected these children's books is a testament to the importance he placed on this kind of literature, on storytelling, and particularly on experience, including perhaps the realms of the domestic, a dimension of his discourse that has seen less attention, at least in the visual arts. In that regard, Steiner's little afterthought about pictures is instructive. Even unimportant ones tell stories, and not always the ones they were intended to illustrate. Reminders of a kind of innocence in a darkening time, the odd little illustrations in children's books, like those Benjamin loved and collected, are no exception. So that is the little sort of travelogue text I wrote. I forgot to show you some of the other Granville illustrations. I couldn't find the ones I was looking for with the sort of little worker birds and stuff like that, but there are a few of these, and this guy who appears in one of my paintings. So I've had a kind of ongoing and kind of long-standing interest in certain kinds of things. I mean, it sounds funny to say history, narrative, representation, reproduction, figure, ground. It's not that they're sort of academic preoccupations. They're kind of, those things are preoccupations because the issues interest me and because now interests me and because they're ways of understanding things or figuring things out. And sometimes very personal things are part of that too. The Benjamin texts that I mentioned in the paper, along with a lot of other material, nourished a lot of these a lot of earlier work, earlier than this, which was a kind of way of thinking through and visually imagining kind of historical shifts, and as a way of trying to sort of figure out where we are now or things like that. So the body of work that I'll show you here began with, it sort of focuses on, a lot of it focuses on the illustrated book. That sort of began with a more personal narrative related to children, not all of which I'll go into here. And then it sort of reincorporated some of those earlier interests in history through the experience of reading children's books to my kids. In these works, the illustrated book takes a variety of forms, from ruin to boat to diptych to stage set to bird's wings. Things like this. That's just an installation shot from the exhibition called The Book that was curated by Diana Nemiroff for Carleton University Art Gallery. It's traveling right now. And the work, as I said, is about a 10-year span. So the earlier pieces, I'll show you a couple really early pieces. They date from, well, not really early, but 2002, something like that, 2001, 2002. And they sort of explored to some extent what I was mentioning in the text a little bit when I was talking about children and ritualized reading and that kind of experience in the way that sort of Benjamin spoke about it. One of the markers of a really good writer is that you find echoes of their work in various places in your own experience of life and stuff like this. And his descriptions of experience in the essay on Baudelaire, on some motifs in Baudelaire, and the storyteller, the kind of unconscious kind of reception of things is really interesting and recurs in a number of ways. So I was, reading these stories to my kids, and it was the repetition of it that I found interesting, the sort of ritualized reading of story. In these sort of rhythms, daily rhythms of nap time. My kids were big book kids, so they got read to all the time. They always wanted read on this sort of, and it just kind of reminded me of, say, the reading of books of hours and things like that, and the kind of unconscious absorption of experience that Benjamin articulates in his essay. So in these, the sort of physical manufacture is seen in the kind of woven grounds, which become a kind of marking time iconography on the book pages. along with this notion of copying that's already there in, like, a few years ago, quite prior to the specific illustrations that I started looking at in terms of copies. So this is, and most of these paintings I'll try and remember to give you some information about the sizes and stuff. The earlier ones are a little smaller, but a lot of them are fairly large. This is like 6.5 by 10 feet, and a lot of the pieces are about that size, so they're fairly large paintings. This is an instance where the book becomes a kind of boat or a vessel, and again, sort of related to, again, not so much sort of larger issues as much as sort of personal, smaller ones. Again, about reading books to children and the kind of experience around that. And so the book becomes a kind of boat and rocking on a sort of woven sea. At the time, I was, as I said, imagining kind of parallels or echoes between the developmental moment when young children encounter images and the way that they do appreciate images, which is something that is really hard for older folk to imagine. But when you watch a 2-year-old encounter images for the first time, it's really quite a remarkable thing. I mean, they are, it's like living in the 15th century for a few minutes. The images are absolutely real, absolutely powerful, and absolutely true to a 2-year-old. I remember sort of a story. It's a wonderful little book called Sand Cake that has this bear underwater. He's in water, kind of up to his stomach. He's lying down, so his stomach's sticking out, his head's sticking out, and his arms are sticking out. And my 2-year-old said, and he's broken. He's broken. The bear was broken because he wasn't entirely visible, and he could not conceive that the bear continued under the water. Or when my 2-year-old came home from daycare and reminded me of, like, all those ballads you'd listen to, right? And he'd say, I met a green man. I met a green man. The man was green, like he was wearing green. And he would always wear green. That was what was remarkable, right? And it's like the stories. She was dressed in green, or he wore the red and the blue. It's the same thing. It's this moment for both. And it has to do with the scarcity and power of the rare image, of the image that isn't, known. So I was kind of interested in those things, and also interested in, at the time, and this includes another element, where there's that sort of dot-to-dot image that recurs in a number of things at this point, where the kids start going to school and they start bringing home those god-awful worksheets that children bring home, when they're like in junior kindergarten or kindergarten, and they have all these things, and these kids who have this amazing, way of looking at the world are taught to circumscribe it in particular ways. And anyway, those sort of dot-to-dot things became a sort of metaphor for me for certain other kinds of constraining structures, or things that, or for the kind of impossibility of trying to reconstruct a past or something like that, where you can just sort of move from fragment to fragment and not really get a sense of the whole. So there was a whole lot of Puss in Boots paintings that started coming out because I was reading these stories to my kids, and because they're set at this time, right? And there is this convergence of this way of thinking, of sort of medieval thinking, best exemplified by, say, a writer like Jan Huizinga in his book, The Waning of the Middle Ages, where he talks about the sort of the ways of appreciating things at that time. So I was reading these stories and thinking about history when I read them, and stuff. So there's a long series of paintings of Puss in Boots. This is about I think it's number 6 or 7. The first one's at the National Gallery, but I don't have an image of it because I was slow to switch to digital. But this one is one that sort of links it to, to a kind of the high art of its time, in a sense, with that little panel across the top, which I forget the reference. It's either like Memling or Roger van der Weyden. It's one of the Flemish primitives. And in the work at that time, I was also, I guess, structurally just sort of putting together certain kinds of spaces. So there's this book there, right? It's this kind of book construction, very physical book. not much of a space behind it. The spaces at the time were kind of this weird convergence of painters that I really like Philip Guston, and Flemish primitive painters who share a certain thing, at least for me. I don't know, maybe it's just my own personal thing, but I find a similarities in the spaces. They're very contingent spaces, slightly tipped up, not really this, not really that, always shifting. That kind of space, very physical, very constructed kinds of spaces. So that's the kind of spaces that these paintings occupied. And they just seem to be able to move between those kinds of spaces. So I just put these things together. A little fragment of the details of the clothing, again, something that's really important in those paintings, and at that time, as it's reflected as well in fairy tales, in those sort of modalities of transformation. They're based on these fine, rare goods. Well, that's what we're looking at with those shoes. The detail, paid to the kind of dress and the way that it's represented, is something that interested me. The dot-to-dot thing as this kind of metaphor for reconstructing the past out of fragments, or reconstructing that cat. We see the image through this kind of cat, through this sort of puss figure. There's a detail of that element there, all taken from little bits of Flemish primitive painters. Guston also, it's interesting that he was, as well as the sort of parallels between, say, Flemish primitives. It's interesting that he was someone who was very much interested in drawing and vernacular kinds of drawing, like cartoon and stuff like that. Crumb, the Crumb drawings and other illustrators like that he was very keen on and very interested in, and there's that sort of relationship as well. Okay, so this is about up to maybe 2007 or 8. It's called, it's another Puss in Boots painting, number 10. And this was the first one that started to juxtapose related illustrations, and also to kind of recontextualize things in terms of a kind of contemporary sort of social or economic situation. So the images there, and again, it's just this very kind of material book in this very material space, this kind of structure that's a sort of a stage set, sort of a structure, I'm not sure what exactly it is. Its kind of constructedness, I think, is emphasized by the fact that the pictures are taken out and leaning. They're not the right size. You can sort of see through them to this other weird space. The landscape, the plowed fields look just like the same loaded brush strokes as the sky or the ground or the construction of the thing. The two illustrations are the first ones that I saw that seemed to have a relationship at that time. One's a copper plate from 1820 from the Hawcliffe collection, and the other is an anonymous mid-19th century illustration. And there were certain sort of similarities between them that I wanted to just sort of point out. And then at the time that I was doing that work, I just kind of stumbled on this, an article. What I was thinking about when I was doing these, when I was thinking about in terms of the relationship of the copies, was what, I shouldn't say thinking about, what I was sort of feeling, shall I say, instead, was something that I always just find really intriguing. And I remember coming across it in, say, the Frick, when suddenly you'd sort of look at one, you'd be looking at some not particularly remarkable little panel painting, and then somewhere else in the museum there's one that looks exactly like it, from maybe a century later and a different country. And you just sort of think, whoa, that's just so weird. I know people copied, but it's not that. What it evokes is this kind of, is the sense of empty space and time between them, that somebody went from here to there, and then, years later, here's a copy in another place. And it just seems to me, those things always just spoke about the lack of stuff in between, the sort of space that wasn't occupied by so many things. And so that was the kind of thing I was thinking about with these when I put them together, that they evoked for me, shall we say. And at the time that I was doing it, I stumbled across this article about the Green Revolution in India. And there was a piece in the Globe and Mail, I think, although there's lots of stuff out there, you can find stuff about it, and how, you know, like this was about a tale of another kind of transformation, only, you know, not a clever cat, but the whole Indian subcontinent sort of transforming itself to a kind of modern agricultural giant through these production methods that would, you know, mean massively increased yields through GMO seed and pesticides and fertilizers and all this sort of stuff. And, you know, it worked for a few years, and farmers did well, and then the soil was completely depleted, and they had no money because they spent it all on they sold their cow, right, for the magic seeds. And that sort of stuff. So the farmers were killing themselves and committing suicide by drinking their pesticides. It's still going on. And there was a photograph of one of these farms in the Globe, and in the back of the photograph there was this guy with an ox and plow. And again, it's like straight out of the 1697 illustrations from Perrault, right? Exactly the same methods. And in the foreground, where the widow is sort of squatting, there was what looked to be, in this depleted field, a shoe, a kind of plastic shoe. And I just sort of thought it just was so strange. I mean, the sort of resonances with this Puss in Boots story on a kind of global scale and stuff like that. So it was just kind of thinking about those kinds of issues of scarcity and excess, and how those kinds of fairy tales are repeated in various ways around the globe. So these shoes ended up in the painting, a bunch of them, bunch of shoes. That's a close-up of that. This is called Jack and the Cornstalk. It's from around the same time, maybe 2008, something like that. Similar size. They're still sort of large paintings and done in a sort of similar way. That story is interesting. Again, you know, selling the cow, which is what those farmers are doing. They're selling their cows for the magic seeds, and how that's a kind of, it's an interesting moment in the story. It's kind of almost market capitalism, this little market transaction, you know, give me the cow, I'll, you know, give you the seeds, and the sort of magic seeds, which is how they are marketed. And I was thinking about it, just kind of recontextualizing it in the context of corn rather than beans, which seemed like an appropriate kind of thing in terms of, you know, what was going on with fuel, you know, corn being used to feed people in some parts of the world, or as fuel for us here. So that's what that one was kind of playing with. This is called Ogre. Again, there's so many of those stories that involve, you know, these transitional objects of clothing, right? This is from Le Petit Poucet, where the little guy down there is pulling off the ogre's boot, and it's just juxtaposed with other boots. This is from the Gustave Doré illustration. There are many, many versions of that illustration, again, sort of copied and recopied and closely modeled, but that's a particularly nice illustration, the Doré version. This isn't a full image. I got the wrong image, and I don't have the full one on my computer here. This is a kind of close-up of a piece called Industrial Fairy Tale, which uses that Granville image that you saw of the sort of capitalist turkey, or whatever he is. No, he's not a turkey. I'm not sure what he is. And the rest of the painting, you can't see them, but scattered across the bottom are sort of these fairly realistic stuffed animals, which are from my children. They're stuffed animals, and just, they're all made in China, right? You know, so all those sort of fairy tale things, and the sort of production of those kinds of stories in places where there isn't really the same kind of conception of childhood, and they don't have those kind of stuffed animals. So it was just kind of relating. You can just see a fox and a rabbit sticking up there, but there was others as well. And the book structure is a little more sort of physical, a little more specific. It combines elements from, on the far side, little elements from, I think it's a nativity scene, again in a Flemish primitive painting with bits of Chinese industrial architecture and things like that. Just kind of a structure of that sort. This is called Puss in the Subcontinent. It's the first one that introduces a kind of figure from a contemporary figure, a farmer from the Indian subcontinent with the same scythe, just walking across that space where the figures in the illustrations have the same kind of farming tools, and this guy's just walking across the space. He's contemporary, but same materials, same methods of production. This is a little painting called, little 3x4, called Tapestry. And it sort of refers back to those kinds of uses of tales like Puss in Boots in copies, advertising, products, and things like that. There's this wonderful collection I came across in my research, which is a collection of sort of day-to-day consumer objects, not just advertisements, but other kinds of things, all based on that story. I mean, there are millions of products from the earliest kinds of products, and you can sort of see you can trace the story and particular illustrations being copied for all these different kinds of products, cheap products, napkins, linens. This was one of those cheap tapestries you'd buy and hang in your house. But even though it was a cheap kind of vernacular copy, it still had a fairly nice illustration, and you could find the other variants of the illustration in other products and other things and other illustrations. And it just combines, again, this sort of weird tipped up sort of space. It's not quite sure where it is, the space, whether it's kind of lying back, those, like those tipped up Flemish primitive spaces, even more tipped, practically coming off. This one, just a sort of simple little piece that combines three of those illustrations, which I showed you, from the three different collections that I had found with rubber boots, camouflage boots. This is I think we're up to about maybe 2009, something like that. Two related versions, the sort of book as a kind of diptych, the sort of ground much more simple. The work becomes more simple, a little less painterly and more monochromatic as it moves along, you will see. This just two related illustrations. One is George Cruikshank, mid-19th century. The other's French, a little bit later. But the similarities in the construction of the image and in the little details of the shoes and things like that. The ground is this kind of woven thing, sort of going back to a bit some of the earlier paintings, but also making reference to kind of crumpled paper, and as later work will have reference to decorative marbled papers in books. This is a large piece called Copies, which uses some of the birds in the Granville collections. In this case, the birds are writing and copying themselves, and it's one of a number of paintings that deal with birds or deal with the book as a kind of bird's wing kind of structure, where it sort of opens up, where the sort of symmetries of and patterning of a wing, for instance, kind of mimic or make reference to printing in their symmetry. And this has some other birds looking on, just sort of playing with the sort of, there's a number of bird paintings here that make use of the same kinds of illustrations and ideas about sort of symmetry and patterning, camouflage, display, the sort of relationships of those things. This one, there's a couple of details. It's called Camouflage. That's a couple of the birds, a pelican and something else from Granville dressed as fishermen. And in the foreground is a sort of a figure with this kind of bird outfit. Some of the fairy tales, of course, would have figures dressed in animal skin like Peau d'Âne or those other stories. This one I was just kind of wondering about what it would be like to wear, to not have to choose what you wore, and to be, sort of permanently decked out in feathers of a particular color. So the birds are dressed as humans and the humans dressed as a bird. Here's another one of the same sort of series that got sort of reworked over time, much more sort of painterly. In this case, the image isn't sort of symmetrically reproduced, but just sort of duplicated. And it's an image of kind of, the birds are not dressed inside the book, but they're sort of anthropomorphized in other ways, where they're sort of in heroic kind of postures, and obviously in a kind of 19th century narrative, heroic narrative kind of thing. And the image is just repeated, slightly altered, a copy. So this is, again, these are fairly large. This is like 6.5 by 10. This is a more recent one of the bird series, where the bird is kind of wearing a sort of pattern, decorative pattern, and that's sort of merging into the kind of a sort of ground which I'm exploring a little more recently with that makes reference again to sort of decorative papers and marbled papers and those kinds of things, and sort of interweaving those things with it. So there's a couple of installation shots of a show at René Blouin in Montreal. And so the works around this time, about a year ago or so, began combining these sort of contemporary photos more consistently with, their contemporary photos of faraway places. Again, the sort of the long ago with the far away. There are photos that are relatively contemporary of farming practices that, or other things, other settings, shall we say, in which these historical fairy tale illustration figures are set. And this is one of them. It's called Le Petit Poucet, or Tom Thumb. You'll see the little guy there. It's a German illustration. He's just entering the frame. But that's it's just so weird, because the 19th century images, or even sometimes 17th century images, can look more recent than the contemporary photographs, right? So that's a photograph of Pakistan now, right? The little guy looks more contemporary than that. So that's a cattle market in Pakistan. And the same sort of ground of a kind of crumpled paper or woven sort of thing, with sort of decorative paper illustration references, borders, like that. And in this case, there's text in the corners, which is in various languages, like Farsi and Arabic, and a couple others I don't remember. And it says things like Tom Thumb lettuce, things like that, the kinds of ways that those things are used to advertise those products in various places and parts of the world. And so there's a few of these paintings in a series called Le Maître Chat, which is the master cat, or Puss in Boots in French. Harvest. That's always, it's one of the scenes that's illustrated very regularly in that story, which is the scene where the cat is coming. You all know the story, eh? The cat's coming through, he's tricked everybody and all this sort of stuff, and he's coming through the, quote, the richly harvested fields of the Marquis of Carabas. And he convinces the peasants that the fields belong to his master, the poor miller's son. And he just tricks them, and they believe him. So it's an important scene, and it's obviously an important issue. Food is an important issue. Food is one of those things that's sparking the Arab Spring, and food prices and stuff like that, and as well as all the things going on with GMO product and seed and all of the things that I was mentioning in terms of those other issues. There's obviously a lot of other things going on that relate to that story, in the sense that hedge fund managers are now buying up all the land in those places, in Africa and everywhere else. So it's a kind of similar sort of trickery, clever cats. There's another one. And another one. So I started looking for more photographs. I just started, sort of digging around for more photographs of those kinds of places, kind of contemporary, long ago places. And ended up looking at Afghanistan, which is obviously a place where we're involved in a literal as well as a metaphorical kind of war with history, or a relationship with history. And in that instance, the farming practices are similar, if not more primitive, probably more primitive there than in the Indian subcontinent. As well, there are much more sort of rigid strictures in terms of clothing, which are interesting because they relate to those kinds of fairy tales and the sort of the kinds of rigid sort of structures, social and hierarchical structures, and how they related to clothing and stuff like that. Obviously, in these cases, it's related to sort of, well, depending on how you read it or interpret it, religion or culture, rather than just class. But sumptuary laws, for instance, I mean, at the time in the West, the sort of definition of sumptuary laws are things that were frequently meant to prevent commoners from imitating the appearance of aristocrats, and sometimes also to stigmatize disfavored groups. In the late Middle Ages, sumptuary laws were instituted as a way for the nobility to cap the conspicuous consumption of the prosperous bourgeoisie of medieval cities. And they continued to be used for these purposes until well into the 17th century. Well, this is obviously a different kind of sumptuary law, this sort of prohibiting of certain kinds of clothing, but like the sort of fairy tales, it's interesting that in the case of particularly the sort of strictures about women's clothing, what is it that becomes the sort of issue? Shoes, right? Those are the things you can see. Those are the things you can wear high heels, right? You can sort of this is the entire expression of mobility or individuality or anything, right? It's shoes, again, just like the Puss in Boots story or the Petit Poucet or anything like that. So this painting is called Cendrillon. It's about 5 feet by, I don't know, a little over 5 by 9, roughly, something like that. And it has a female cat. I wasn't quite sure what I was doing when I started it out. I had something else in there and I put that female cat. Originally, Puss in Boots was a female cat. You'd never know that now, but in the earlier versions, it was always a she. It only later became a he in some of the versions that were written down, and that stuck. But the early versions, the cat was female. This is from a postcard, that particular cat. And I just decided to combine with that a pumpkin. I'm not sure why. I just sort of started out as sort of Puss in Boots and ended up as Cinderella. And that particular pumpkin is from a Gustave Doré illustration, a well-known Doré illustration. And I thought the pumpkin needed wheels, and I don't know, I just wanted to put it on a wagon, because that was kind of like, something from our childhood. And I was looking for a picture of a wagon I could use that had the right angle, and the one that I found said America's Promise on it. So that seemed to kind of work its way in there. It wasn't all that intentional. And then this figure is kind of running away. This is a slightly smaller painting called The Governor General's Disguise. It was, again, I was digging through archives, looking for images, and I came across this picture. It's an archival photo of one of the Earls of Grey. He was Governor General of Canada, and I'm not sure what year. I'd have to check, I forget. But he is dressed up in a Puss in Boots costume in this archival photograph. And not only is it a Puss in Boots costume, but it is a Puss in Boots costume that you can trace back to a particular illustration with 99% certainty. And that is, again, a Gustave Doré. It's the famous Doré illustration. It's the only one that had him dressed in this thing with the collar and that particular necklace of claws and that particular bag. You might know the illustration. It's quite well known. So this guy had a costume made up based on Gustave Doré's illustration for Puss in Boots and posed for a photograph in it. For what purpose, I have no idea. But it was just so damn funny and weird. And so he got put in a field with the little guy on the right is a Puss in Boots figure from a label for yarn in the 19th century, I think, or maybe it's earlier. I'm not sure. I don't have all the details. But it's a yarn label, so it's like this big, right? And he's costumed as this sort of Napoleonic general. It's just so strange the way that the stories get retold and reconfigured in these different ways. And then there's just another sort of contemporary figure in the field. They start having, just sort of by themselves, having all these references, right? And these sort of colonial and other kinds of historical references when you put these things together. This is a larger piece called Camouflage Fields, and it sort of combines, again, figures from, the farmers in the field from 19th century Puss in Boots illustration with contemporary guys. The cat is from a lovely illustration in the Berlin State Library that I found. And then that thing in the middle, I'm not sure what that is. These objects started kind of suggesting themselves, these sort of 19th century colonial views of the place as sort of intermediary objects in these paintings. There's a number of them. This is called Illustration. It's a smaller piece, similar figure, cat in a sort of vortex, or with a kind of vortex of time or circumstance, or paint that looks like marbled paper. So the paintings become pretty monochromatic and sort of simple at this point, much less painterly than the earlier ones, obviously. That, I think, reflects the sources that I was working with, which are these photographs, which are, if not black and white photographs, a lot of the photographs, if they're from Afghanistan, for instance, they're remarkably monotone. The sort of sand-colored robes and the sand, like everything is the same color. I mean, there is no detail, there's no color, there's no whatever, which is, part of what's interesting about looking at those images. And part of what's interesting about, sort of comparing, or what's interesting for me, one of the things interesting for me in looking at them is, comparing them with those, that little strip of images in the early Puss in Boots, right, where I was talking about how every single pair of shoes is different. Every hat is different in a Van Eyck. Every, like these sort of, these medieval paintings, everybody's wearing a different hat. Everyone has different shoes. They're painted with incredible care. The costumes they're all sort of individual. You can sort of trace the history of capitalism through those kinds of, through representation. And you can trace a lot of things that way. Whereas you look at these photos of now, and everyone is wearing exactly the same thing except the shoes. It's the only difference. So they're monochromatic in this way, partly reflecting the sources. The illustrations are usually non-colored. They're usually black and white. The photo sources are either black and white or have very little color information. So they're pretty simple kinds of things, simple ideas, putting together these things from different times and different places. These are smaller paintings called Field 1, Field 2. This is called The Slipper. It's a Cinderella figure from the Baldwin collection. The sort of running, sort of burqa. In the background are the Bamiyan caves from Afghanistan, which, coincidentally look like the figures in the burqas. The sort of blankness, the sort of simple form. Those are the caves that had contained the Hindu, the ancient Hindu sculptures that the Taliban blew up and destroyed. So there's just a few more. This is called Pantoufle de Verre. It's an illustration from Cendrillon, from Cinderella, from an early Perrault collection. That particular prince I just found really interesting in the way he's sort of swooping down. So he's swooping down into, again, a contemporary setting with a fairly large border of that sort of decorative paper. This is another one of that series called The Ground Opened, which is a line from the story from which the figure comes, which is Riquet à la houppe, from the same early Perrault collection. And here I was starting to play as well, I think, with with other things like the sort of framing of the sort of, the borders really kind of significant here, and the sort of borders of illustrations, they are spaces that are constructed spaces. They move inward, right? They are, you work within the frame, you build your image within the frame. Very different from a kind of photographic space, right, where you just capture what you capture and something's going off. So in this instance, it's the sort of the contemporary figures, which don't look that contemporary, the burqa figures in this instance, who are kind of moving off screen. So they're, kind of moving in front, moving off. They kind of make reference in this spatial construction to a contemporary situation, whereas the illustrations and the borders make reference to a kind of pre-modern, pre-photographic kind of construction. This is another one called Disenchantment. So what happened when I started looking at these photographs too was they started suggesting their own connections to these kinds of stories, in the sense that the figures, when they're clothed this way in these sort of complete coverings, what becomes important is a sort of gesture. Right? So what happens is you can't see any facial features, you can't see anything. So they start to have this kind of quality that is actually very much like the very earliest illustrations, because those very early illustrations had no detail. They're tiny, they're like this, and they consist of these very exaggerated gestures. I mean, you can think about it in terms of even later things like 19th century genre painting or things like that as well, right? Where you have these exaggerated kinds of gestures. So that's what you end up relying on when the figure is dressed like this. You kind of, you look for those gestures, or they start to read in terms of gesture. That's the only way you can interpret them, right? Because there's no other information. So I started combining some of these with these other gestural figures, sort of melodramatic kind of gestural figures. I don't know, that frog and that rat just kill me. I just thought they were so strange, and they got put together with so I mean, there's that going on, and there's the reference to the sort of the story, and there's a reference to the link, I guess, is one between scarcity, fairy tales in terms of scarcity, and these places in terms of scarcity. I mean, there's, these are places where there is not much on the road, right? You meet a stranger, those stories, and she met an old woman. That's the name of the next one. She met an old woman on the road, or, somebody comes to your door, or you meet someone in this rural space that has nothing in it. Well, that's what those places look like still. I mean, places like Afghanistan. And imagine, you can't see the person anyway, right? They're totally covered. So there's this mystery. They just seem to, the scarcity and a number of other things seem to suggest these kind of relationships, or these kind of narrative conventions from earlier societies. And I don't know, I'm just kind of interested in exploring them still. There's just something that I find curious about putting them together. So this woman is on the one on the right is from a Perrault story, and the little sort of fox, I'm not even sure what story that's from. They're not the same story though. And then the other figure in the front, who's kind of looking to see through her mesh. I don't know, they just seem to start talking to each other. There's again the sort of reference to the kind of weaving, where the sort of ground, is just a kind of stroke that becomes a landscape, and then it kind of gets woven, and then it starts to agitate and become a particular kind of marbled paper again, that sort of thing. And then there's a couple of other recent paintings which are a little harder for me to discuss, kind of vague in the sense of what they're about. There's again a sort of bird in a lot of them, in these spaces that are kind of dark spaces. And the bird has markings, you can't see it that well, but they're sort of markings that are not bird markings. Again, it's sort of playing with those same kinds of relationships. As some of the other bird paintings, but the markings are sort of monetary markings or calculations or things like that on its chest. And that's actually a picture of one of my kids with this weird arm. So for me, they have something vaguely to do. I can't be very specific about them. They have something vaguely to do with just kind of a fairly bleak outlook these days on sort of environmental kinds of concerns. For one thing, that's a very sort of tar-colored ground. Not exactly happy stories. These birds that are sort of stuck in the ground, sort of decorated with, not their natural markings, but sort of human patterns imposed on them. And then there's, in the background of that, this is a large piece. That's another 6.5 by 10 feet. And that's got a number of the Granville birds that you might recognize, the sort of strutting capitalist birds. I don't know, it's like a kind of, it's vaguely related to Occupy Wall Street, I think, and the tar sands and a number of other things, but not terribly specifically. And this is the last image. It's just the most recent piece that I have. It's called Sagami. And it's got a figure from an archive that I found a long time ago, and it's been sitting around for years waiting for a place. This little weird stick man, twig man, with his baluchon. Anyway, he's walking across a space, and that's just more of it's a photograph that I had. It's vaguely related, but it's more sort of personal. I was, this summer, my husband and kids and I went trying to find the graves of my grandparents up in, around Lac Saint-Jean, Alma Lac Saint-Jean, or Sagami as it's called. And they had, it's kind of related to those sort of workers in a lot of the other paintings. They had come from Finland when my father was an infant to work on building hydroelectric projects there, and they promptly died as soon as they got there in rather dire conditions. My father was orphaned in Quebec, and then later sort of taken by an uncle who was here to Russia, where they thought things would be better in the 30s before it became known what was going on. And then he was shipped to a camp, grew up in a camp in Siberia and escaped. Anyway, so we were looking for the graves, couldn't find them. But we found a lot of other graves of workers that had passed through there, and it's sort of, it's just kind of one of those places like the sort of arrival cities of, all over the world, or like the tar sands now, where people pass through for work, looking for work, looking for whatever. And that guy walking across the logs in the river, just the stick man and the logs just seemed to fit, so I put him there. And the frame is, making reference to both water and oil and other things like that. So it's a bit more of a sort of personal story of the same kinds of things, of the same kinds of wonderings about the same kinds of issues. So all of the work in various ways deals with, to some extent, greater or lesser, with both, I guess, a personal kind of look at larger issues, social issues, political issues, wondering about those things more than sort of saying something about them, but thinking about them. I wish I could think about them less. I'd probably be a lot happier. But that's what they do, and for whatever that's worth. So I don't know if you have any questions, but that's about that's all the images I've got for you anyway.